She had loved him for 7 years without saying a word. 7 years watching him walk through the bakery door every Thursday morning, 7 years laughing as if her heart wasn't breaking into tiny pieces. But when a wealthy man from afar arrived and placed a marriage proposal in her hand, she knew she had only one night to choose: remain silent forever or gamble everything on her heart. Like and comment the city you're viewing from so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because Clara Harlow's story will change the way you see love, courage, and the women the world has overlooked. The bread was burning. Clara Harlow smelled it before she heard the hiss, that sharp, acrid curl of smoke that meant she'd let her mind wander again, which she couldn't afford to do on a Thursday. Thursdays were always busy. She yanked the cast-iron door of the oven open with her bare hand out of habit, then swore under her breath when the heat bit into her palm. She grabbed the cloth hanging from her apron string and pulled the loaf out, setting it on the cooling rack with a thud that sent a small puff of flour up into the air. She pressed her burned hand against the cool stone of the countertop and exhaled. The loaf wasn't ruined, just darker than she liked on the bottom crust. She could work with that. She'd been working with worse her whole life. Blackstone Ridge woke up slow on Thursday mornings in late October. The sky outside the bakery window was still that flat, pale gray that came before real dawn, and the main street was quiet except for old Hector Plum's dog nosing around the water trough 2 doors down. Clara had been up since 4. She was always up since 4. The bakery didn't run itself, and she didn't have anyone to run it with her. She rolled her shoulders, cracked her neck, and went back to work. By the time the sun was properly up and the street outside began filling with the sounds of wagons and boot heels on packed earth, Clara had 3 dozen rolls cooling on the rack, 2 apple pies in the oven, a cinnamon loaf wrapped and ready behind the counter, and flour in her hair that she wouldn't discover until noon. She wiped her hands on her apron, which had long since given up being clean, and flipped the sign on the door from closed to open. The first customers came in 1s and 2s, folks she knew by name, by habit, by what they took in their coffee if they stayed to drink it. Mrs. Alderman always bought 2 of the small rye loaves and always remarked that they were slightly smaller than last week, even when they weren't. The Hendry boys came in together and spent 4 minutes debating which roll to split before one of them remembered they'd left their money at the livery. Tom Bassett stopped in for a pie and gave her the same half-smile he'd been giving her for 3 years, the one that never quite reached his eyes, that said, "Nice girl, shame about the rest of it." Clara thanked him and made change without letting any of what she felt cross her face. She was good at that. She had been the plain girl her whole life. Not plain in the way people meant kindly, not simple or unpretentious, but plain the way that meant she'd been passed over, spoken over, noticed only in the way that furniture gets noticed, because it's useful and it stays where you put it. She was a large woman, wide through the shoulders and hips, with thick hands that were always slightly rough from the work. Her face was round and honest and ordinary. She had her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and absolutely none of the things that made men in Blackstone Ridge look twice. What she had instead was this: the best bred in 3 counties, an instinct for business that she'd never been able to fully explain, and a memory for detail that bordered on inconvenient. She noticed everything. She always had. She noticed, for instance, the exact moment Ethan Mercer's horse appeared at the far end of Main Street. She wasn't watching for him. That's what she told herself every Thursday, with a conviction that had grown more threadbare over the years. She was restocking the front display. She happened to look up. And there he was, coming in from the North Road on that big gray mare he'd had for 4 years now, the one he'd named Duster because of the way she kicked up the trail behind her. Ethan Mercer was not a complicated man to look at. He was lean and dark-haired and had the kind of face that weather had worked on honestly. Not harshly, just marked. He'd broken his nose twice, which had given it a slight leftward drift. He had a scar along his jaw from a fence wire incident he'd described once as entirely his own fault and then refused to elaborate on. He was 34 years old and had been running the Mercer Horse Ranch on the edge of town since his father's health had started failing 5 years ago, which meant he hadn't taken a vacation, a long ride for pleasure, or a single full Sunday of rest in all that time. Clara knew this not because she'd been paying particular attention to him, but because she paid attention to everything, and Ethan Mercer came into her bakery every single Thursday morning without exception. He tied Duster to the post out front and came through the door the way he always did, ducking slightly out of reflex even though the door frame cleared him by 3 inches, and he brought the cold air in with him and a small amount of trail dust that settled on the nearest pie tin. "Morning, Clara." "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She didn't ask why. She pulled the cinnamon loaf from behind the counter and wrapped it in paper without being asked because he got the same thing every week, and he sat down on the stool at the end of the counter and took off his hat and set it on his knee. "What kind of week was it?" she asked, because she always asked, and because she actually wanted to know. "Lost a foal on Tuesday." He said it plainly, but she heard the weight under it. "Mother didn't make it either. Sometimes it goes that way." "I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment in that direct way he had that she'd never quite gotten used to. Most people's eyes slid off her face. Ethan's never did. "You ever have a week where everything you touch just goes sideways?" "Every third week," she said. "Sometimes every second." He almost smiled. "How do you get through it?" "I bake more bread." She set a mug of coffee in front of him without asking. "And then I eat some of it." He did smile at that, the real one, the one that reached all the way up. And Clara turned away to the back counter because she had learned, over 7 years, that there was a specific length of time she could look at Ethan Mercer smiling before something in her chest started doing things she couldn't afford. 7 years. She'd been 22 when she'd bought out the bakery from old Martin Crew, who'd wanted to retire to his daughter's place in the valley. 22 and terrified, with every cent she'd saved from 4 years of working in Martin's kitchen, and a loan from the bank that had taken 2 tries to secure because the loan officer, a Mr. Gale, had looked at her across the desk and said, "Miss Harlow, a young woman running a business of this kind alone. Are you certain you've thought this through?" She had thought through nothing else for 6 months, but she'd said yes, sir, and walked out with the papers signed. Ethan had come in for the first time about 3 months after she'd taken over. He'd been a customer of Martin's, and he'd walked in expecting Martin, and instead found Clara reorganizing the shelves and covered in powdered sugar. He'd stood in the doorway looking confused for a moment, and she'd said, "The old man retired. I bought it. Can I help you?" And he'd said that cinnamon loaf. If you have one, and she'd had one, and that had been that. 3 months after that, she'd understood that she was in trouble. It hadn't been any single thing. It was the accumulation of Thursdays, of small conversations about nothing that felt like more than nothing, of the way he asked her questions and then actually listened to the answers, which was rarer than it should have been. It was the time the roof had leaked badly in a spring storm, and he'd come in on a Friday, not his usual day, a Friday, and spent 2 hours patching it because he'd heard Tom Bassett mention it at the feed store. He'd refused payment. He'd left flour on his sleeve from leaning against the counter and hadn't noticed. She'd noticed. She had tried over the years to be sensible about it. She knew what she was. She knew what Blackstone Ridge thought of her. She'd overheard Mrs. Calloway telling someone at the dry goods store that Clara Harlow has a good heart, bless her, but some women just aren't meant for that kind of life. She'd heard the younger men at the saloon make their comments about her in the particular way that men do when they think no one's listening, which was to say, loudly enough that everyone could hear. She had learned to carry that weight without showing it, which was different from it not being heavy. And Ethan could have had anyone. She'd seen the way women looked at him. She'd watched Mrs. Dale's niece come to visit for a month 2 summers ago and engineer 3 separate reasons to be in front of the bakery on Thursday mornings. She had watched, very carefully, and given nothing away. And when the niece had gone back east without any kind of understanding with Ethan, she had not let herself feel relieved. She was sensible. She was practical. She was not the kind of woman who indulged in feelings that led nowhere useful. She was also, apparently, the kind of woman who burned bread when she thought about him too long on a Thursday morning, which was somewhat at odds with her self-image. Julian Ashford arrived in Blackstone Ridge on a Wednesday, which was not a Thursday, and Clara didn't see him until Friday, when he came into the bakery at 11 in the morning, wearing clothes that cost more than her monthly receipts, and looking around the shop the way wealthy men sometimes did, appraisingly, as if calculating its worth in a category she didn't know the name of. He was handsome. There was no use pretending he wasn't. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with silver beginning at his temples, and the easy, unhurried posture of a man who had never had to rush anywhere in his life. He was a cattle investor, as the town had already established through the reliable machinery of gossip. here to look at land for a potential operation in the Eastern Valley. He had money. He had manners. He had apparently a particular appreciation for good baking because he tried one of her almond rolls and spent a full 30 seconds looking at the ceiling after the first bite. "Miss Harlow," he said, "this is remarkable." "Thank you," she said. She was not unaccustomed to compliments about the food. "I don't say that lightly. I've eaten in some of the better restaurants in St. Louis and Kansas City, and this is better than most of what they're serving." She looked at him. He seemed to mean it. "You're kind," she said. "I'm not kind particularly. I'm accurate." He set the roll down and looked at her with the frank directness of a man who was used to assessing situations quickly. "May I ask, you run this entirely on your own?" "I do." "That's impressive." "Most people find it unusual." "Most people," he said mildly, "are not particularly perceptive." She didn't know what to make of that, so she sold him 4 more rolls and a whole pie, and he left a tip that was significantly larger than necessary. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the following week, Blackstone Ridge had reached the conclusion that Julian Ashford was courting Clara Harlow, which was the kind of thing the town found simultaneously romantic and bewildering. Romantic because he was wealthy and attentive and brought her a small bunch of late-season wildflowers on his 4th visit, and bewildering because nobody quite understood why a man like that would direct his attention toward a woman like her, and several people said so out loud without appearing to realize that was unkind. Claire herself was not certain what to make of it. He was good company. He was intelligent and had read widely and had opinions about things that were worth arguing with, and he argued well, not to win, but because he was genuinely interested in the argument. He listened to her. He asked about the business with real curiosity, not the patronizing half-interest she sometimes got from the men on the town council when she needed something from them. He was, she thought, a genuinely decent man who had for some reason decided to apply considerable energy in her direction. She tried to feel something uncomplicated about that, and found she couldn't. Because every Thursday, Ethan still came in. He still sat at the end of the counter. He still asked what kind of week it had been and actually waited for the answer. And one Thursday, 3 weeks into Julian Ashford's campaign, Ethan had walked in while Julian was still finishing his coffee at the far end of the counter, and the 2 men had looked at each other the way 2 men do when they've arrived at the same destination from different directions and aren't sure who got there first. Julian had been gracious. He'd introduced himself, asked about the horse operation, said something knowledgeable about breeding stock that surprised Ethan into a real answer. He'd finished his coffee and said his goodbyes to Clara and walked out without looking back. Ethan had been quiet for a long moment after the door closed. "He seems like a serious fellow," he said finally. "He does," Clara agreed carefully. Ethan turned his mug in his hands. He had large hands, she'd always noticed, not for any particular reason, just because she noticed things. His knuckles were scarred from work. Are you... He stopped, started again differently. "He treating you well?" "He's been a gentleman," she said. Ethan nodded. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. She'd spent 7 years learning to read him, and there were still things she couldn't reach. "Good," he said. "That's good." He finished his coffee and left 20 minutes earlier than usual. Julian proposed on a Thursday evening. He came to the bakery after hours, after she'd already closed up and was scrubbing the counters, and he knocked on the glass and she let him in because she could see from his face that something particular was happening. He had a small box from a jeweler in Hayes City that she later learned he'd ridden 2 days to get. Inside was a ring that was modest enough not to be insulting and fine enough to be real. He didn't make a speech about it. She'd expected a speech. He was eloquent when he wanted to be. But instead, he just set the box on her clean counter and said, "I know this is fast. I know we haven't known each other long. But I've been paying attention, Miss Harlow, and you are. You are not like anyone I've met in a very long time. And I'm not a man who lets things that matter to him pass by without saying so." Clara looked at the ring. She looked at Julian. She thought about the life he was offering, security, comfort, a man who saw her clearly and had chosen her deliberately, who had no illusions about her and wanted her anyway. She thought about what Mrs. Calloway and Tom Bassett and all the rest of them would think. And then she tried to stop thinking about what they would think. She thought about Ethan sitting on that stool. She thought about, is he treating you well? She thought about 7 years and a burning loaf of bread and a roof patched on a Friday. I need a night, she said. Just one night. Julian looked at her for a long moment. You can have it, he said. I'll be at the hotel. Take all the time you need, within reason. After he was gone, Clara stood alone in her bakery in the dark for a long time. The flour on her hands had dried and was flaking off at the knuckles. The ovens had gone cold hours ago. Through the window, she could see Main Street settling into night, the lights in the saloon, the dark shapes of horses at the rail, the wide, flat sky above the ridge that was pressing down on everything with its enormous weight. She thought, carefully and slowly, about what she actually wanted. Not what was realistic, not what was sensible, not what Blackstone Ridge thought she deserved or didn't deserve. What she wanted. She was 29 years old. She had run this bakery for 7 years, and she had made it work, and she was proud of that, genuinely, without qualification. She had carried her loneliness without complaint and managed her feelings about Ethan Mercer with what she considered to be considerable discipline and maturity. And she had watched the years go by and told herself that this was fine, that she was fine, that a woman could build a whole life out of good bread and honest work and not need anything else. She had believed herself, more or less, until right now. Now, standing alone in the dark with flour on her hands and a man's proposal cooling on her counter, she found that she did not entirely believe herself anymore. She untied her apron. She folded it over the back of the stool where Ethan always sat. She put on her coat and her good boots, not her work boots, the ones she wore all day, but the other ones that she only wore when she had somewhere particular to be. She turned off the last lamp. She locked the door behind her. And then Clara Harlow, who was sensible and practical and had spent 7 years not doing what she was about to do, walked out into the cold October dark and started down the road toward the Mercer Ranch. It was 4.5 miles. The road was rutted and she had no lantern, and the wind had come up off the ridge and was finding every gap in her coat. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had no particular plan for what she was going to say when she got there. She only knew that Julian Ashford had offered her a door, and that before she walked through it or walked away from it, she had to know. She had to actually, finally know, what was on the other side of a different door entirely. The one she'd been standing in front of for 7 years. The stars were very bright over the ridge, and her boots on the packed earth road made a sound like a slow, steady heartbeat, and Clara Harlow walked into the dark and did not look back. The road to the Mercer Ranch was longer in the dark than it had any right to be. Clara had walked it in daylight twice before. Once to deliver a special order of rolls when Ethan's father had been bedridden with fever and couldn't come to town, and once because she'd taken a wrong turn on the way back from visiting the Hendry farm and ended up adding a mile to her afternoon. Both times she'd known where she was going and had the sun to prove it. Now she had neither, and the October wind had a particular meanness to it that seemed to find the spaces between her buttons and settle there. She kept moving. The stars were clear at least, and she knew the road by shape, the way it dipped at the creek crossing, the long flat stretch that always smelled faintly of sage, the place where the fence posts on the left side started getting closer together, which meant the Mercer property was beginning. She counted those posts without meaning to. She counted a lot of things when she was nervous. Fence posts, floorboards, the knots in the ceiling beams of her bakery, on nights she couldn't sleep. It was a habit she'd never managed to break. She had not let herself rehearse what she was going to say. Every time her mind moved toward it, she pushed it away because if she rehearsed it, she would hear how it sounded and then she would turn around. So instead, she thought about bread, the specific gravity of a good sourdough starter, the way the crust on an apple pie should feel when you tapped it, the mathematics of scaling a recipe up without losing what made it right. Practical things. Things that held still. The ranch lights came into view around the last bend, and her stomach dropped the way it did when she misjudged the bottom step coming downstairs in the dark. There were 2 lit windows in the main house and a lamp burning in the stable, which meant Ethan was still up, which she'd half hoped and half dreaded. She stopped at the gate and stood there for a moment, one hand on the post, breathing steam into the cold air. She could still go back. She thought about that clearly, without pretending it wasn't an option. She could walk back into town, go back to her bakery, sleep on the cot she kept in the storeroom for long production nights, and in the morning she could go to Julian Ashford's hotel and say yes, and that would be a life. It would be a decent life. He was a good man. She stood at the gate for 30 more seconds. Then she opened it and walked toward the house. She knocked. 3 times, not too hard. She wasn't trying to alarm anyone, just to be heard. There was a pause long enough that she'd started drafting an exit in her head, and then boots crossed a wooden floor, and the door opened, and Ethan was standing there in his work shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a look on his face that went through about 4 different expressions in less than 2 seconds. Clara. He looked past her at the empty road. Did something happen? No, I mean, not in the way you mean. She was already regretting not rehearsing. Nothing's wrong. I needed to come here. He stepped back from the door. Come inside, it's freezing. She came in. The main room was plain and warm, with a low fire in the grate and the remains of a meal on the table and one of his father's old horse almanacs open on the chair, like he'd set it down mid-page. It smelled like pine smoke and leather oil, and faintly of coffee that had gone cold a while ago. She had never been inside the house before, and it surprised her how much she recognized in it anyway. The practical arrangement of things. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative that wasn't also functional. Ethan didn't offer her a chair or coffee or any of the usual things. He just stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with that direct gaze and waited, because he was, she remembered, a man who did not fill silence with noise. She'd always respected that about him. She was also, right now, finding it extremely inconvenient. Julian Ashford asked me to marry him tonight, she said. Something moved behind Ethan's eyes. He didn't speak. He's a good man, she continued, because apparently she was going to say all of it, right now in this warm room she'd never been in before. He's attentive, and he's smart, and he looks at me like I'm a person he actually wants to know, and I could say yes. I've been standing in the road for 20 minutes thinking about whether I should say yes, because by any reasonable accounting, it makes sense. She stopped, started again. But I can't say yes before I do this, and I couldn't keep not doing it, so here I am. Here you are, Ethan said quietly. I'm in love with you. She said it plain the way she'd state a fact about flower weights or rising times, because if she dressed it up, she would lose her nerve, and she had walked 4.5 miles in the dark for this. I have been for a long time. I don't know exactly when it started. I think it was gradual, like the way water gets into stone. You don't see it happening, and then one day the crack is just there. And I'm not telling you because I expect anything. I know this might not be. I just needed you to know before I made a decision about the rest of my life, because it seemed dishonest not to. Dishonest to him, and dishonest to you, and mostly dishonest to me. The fire made a small sound in the grate. Outside, the wind pushed against the shutters. Ethan looked at her for a long time without saying anything, which under ordinary circumstances would have been fine because she understood him and his silences, but right now every second of it was its own particular kind of agony. Say something, she said finally. Please. Even if it's... just say something. I'm trying to figure out where to start, he said. Start anywhere. He exhaled slowly and looked down at his hands, and when he looked back up, his face had something in it she hadn't seen before, something raw and unguarded and slightly pained, like he'd been holding something heavy for so long his arms had gotten used to the weight, and now he was setting it down and feeling it for the first time. You think I come in every Thursday for the cinnamon loaf? He said. She blinked. Don't you? Clara, I've made my own cinnamon loaf. I know how. He looked at her steadily. I come in every Thursday because it's the best part of my week. The silence this time was different. I didn't know how to... He stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. You had this whole operation you'd built yourself, and you were clearly good at it, and you didn't need anyone's help. And every time I thought about saying anything, I thought, what does she need with a man who's mortgaged to his saddle and dealing with a failing ranch and a sick father? What am I going to offer her? You could have asked me that, Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I know. He said it simply, without excuse. I didn't. That was cowardice. I'm not going to dress it up. How long? She asked. He considered the question with the same seriousness he gave everything. About 5 years. Clara sat down, not elegantly, just because her legs had decided they'd done enough. She sat down in the chair with his father's almanac in it, and the almanac slid to the floor, and neither of them picked it up. 5 years, she said, give or take. Ethan, I know. We have both been... She stopped because she didn't have a word for what they'd been. Or maybe the word was too obvious and too absurd. She almost laughed. She felt the laugh rise up in her chest, and then it turned into something else, something that stung at the back of her eyes, and she pressed her lips together and refused to let it become crying because she was not going to cry in Ethan Mercer's front room. That was not how this was going to go. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair so his eyes were level with hers, which meant she couldn't look away without making a point of it. I meant what I said, he told her. I'm not trying to make it sound better than it was. I was afraid, and I let it go too long, and you deserve better than a man who let 7 years pass because he was scared you'd say no. He held her gaze. But if you're asking me what I want you to not say yes to Julian Ashford. Because I want to court you properly, if you'll let me. He said it plainly, the same way she'd said, I'm in love with you, without decoration. No more Thursday mornings pretending the cinnamon loaf is the point, actually courting you, actually doing the thing I should have done 5 years ago. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You understand this is very inconveniently timed, she said. I know. I have a man waiting at the hotel for an answer. I know that too. And you're asking me to tell him no based on what exactly? A declaration in your front room at midnight? Ethan almost smiled. When you say it like that, it does sound thin. It is thin, she said, but she was not leaving. He knew she was not leaving. She could see that he knew it in the set of his shoulders, the slight relaxation in them. It's thin, he agreed. But it's true. That's the one thing I've got. Clara looked at the fire, then at the almanac on the floor, then at this man she had been quietly, carefully loving for 7 years, who had apparently been doing something very similar from his end and been just as stubborn and just as afraid about it. You're going to have to actually court me, she said. Not just show up on Thursdays. Actually, deliberately, do the thing. Yes. In front of the town. Not quietly. Something flickered in his face at that. He understood what she was asking. Blackstone Ridge had its opinions about Clara Harlow, and those opinions were not kind, and if Ethan Mercer was going to be with her, he was going to have to do it visibly, which meant absorbing whatever commentary came along with it. Yes, he said, the same as before. She nodded slowly. She looked at her hands in her lap, the rough skin at the knuckles, the flowers she hadn't quite gotten out from under her nails. These hands that had been building something for 7 years. Carefully. Practically. All right, she said. She walked back to town that night because she wasn't going to stay. That wasn't where they were yet. And also because she needed to think on her way to the hotel. The wind had died down slightly and the stars were still very bright, and her feet had started complaining around the 2nd mile, but she ignored them. She knocked on Julian Ashford's hotel room door at 1:30 in the morning, which she felt some guilt about, but not enough to wait until a more reasonable hour. He answered quickly, still dressed. He hadn't slept either. He looked at her face in the lamplight from the hallway and seemed to understand before she said anything. No, he said. No, she confirmed. I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. Julian was quiet for a moment. He reached up and rubbed the back of his neck, which was the first unpolished gesture she'd ever seen from him. Is it Mercer? She didn't insult him by pretending she didn't know what he meant. Yes. He nodded, slow. I suspected. The way You're very careful, Miss Harlow. You never gave it away. But when he came in that morning, there was something in the room that changed. He looked at her steadily. Does he know? He does now. And we're figuring it out. Julian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite its opposite. He leaned against the doorframe and was quiet for a moment. I meant what I said about you being... I want you to know that was sincere, not a convenience. If things had been different... I know, Claire said. I believe you. He nodded. After a pause, he said, He's a lucky man. I hope he knows that. I intend to make sure he does. This time Julian did smile, brief and genuine. Good night, Miss Harlow. Good night, Mr. Ashford. She walked back to her bakery and let herself in through the back and sat at her work table in the dark for a while, not sleeping, not quite calm enough for sleeping. Her good boots were dusty from the road, and her legs ached, and she had walked something close to 10 miles tonight and had started none of the bread she needed for tomorrow morning. She lit the lamp. She pulled out the flour. Word moved through Blackstone Ridge the way it always did, like water through cracked earth, finding its level by morning. By Thursday of that same week, most of the town knew that Julian Ashford had checked out of the hotel and departed for the valley. And by Saturday, there was a general impression, sourced from nobody in particular, that something had shifted between Clara Harlow and Ethan Mercer. The confirmation came in the form of Ethan showing up at the bakery on Saturday afternoon, not his usual day, not to buy anything, just to stand at the counter and talk to her for an hour while she worked. He came back on Monday. He fixed a loose hinge on her back door that she'd been living with for 3 weeks without asking her if she wanted him to, which she normally would have found presumptuous, but instead found that she didn't. On the following Thursday, he came in at his usual time, sat on his usual stool, and then, when 2 of the Hendry brothers came in and greeted Clara with their standard vague politeness, and Ethan with the kind of warmth they reserved for people they actually considered, Ethan said clearly enough to be heard, "You know, you fellows ought to treat Miss Harlow a bit better than that. She's the best thing in this town, and most of you haven't figured it out yet." There was a silence in the bakery. One of the Hendry brothers looked at his boot. The other looked at the ceiling. Clara kept her face arranged in something neutral, while her heart did something complicated. "Just saying," Ethan added, and picked up his coffee. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a speech. But in Blackstone Ridge, where everyone understood the economy of what was said and not said, it meant something. It was public, deliberate. He had meant for it to be heard. The story made it to Mrs. Calloway's porch by afternoon and to the saloon by evening. And by the next morning, Clara had received 3 separate comments about it from customers, ranging from mildly uncomfortable to genuinely warm, and she responded to all of them the same way, which was to thank the customer and change the subject. What she didn't share, and had no intention of sharing, was that after everyone had cleared out on Thursday afternoon and she was wiping down the counter, Ethan had stayed, and they'd talked. Really talked, the way they'd been doing for years but differently now, without the invisible partition between what was said and what was meant. He told her about his father, who was worse this winter and some days didn't know where he was. She told him about the bank loan she'd taken out in the first year, how she'd been sick with fear the whole first month and had calculated her finances at 4 a.m. so many times she could do it in her sleep. He told her he'd almost sold the ranch 2 years ago. She'd told him about the loan officer who'd asked if she was certain she'd thought it through. "What did you say to him?" Ethan asked. "I said yes, sir, and walked out with the papers." He looked at her for a moment. "What did you want to say?" Clara smiled slightly. "Nothing printable." He laughed, the full version, and it was the best sound she'd heard in a long time. It was not effortless. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. There were Thursday mornings when the easy rhythm they'd had was slightly off, when the awareness of what was between them made the conversation self-conscious in a way it hadn't been before. There were moments when she looked at him and thought about 5 years of Thursdays that could have been different and felt something that wasn't quite regret but was related to it. And Blackstone Ridge was not gracious about it. Not all of it, anyway. Mrs. Calloway said, within Clara's hearing range, that she hoped Ethan knew what he was getting into. Tom Bassett made a comment at the feed store that someone repeated to her third hand, something about Ethan being able to do better. She did not repeat this to Ethan, partly because she didn't want to put him in the position of having to defend her, and partly because she had been managing her own business for 7 years, and didn't need a man to do it now. What she did instead was what she had always done. She worked. She showed up. She baked the bread, and ran the accounts, and fixed what broke and built what was missing, and conducted herself with the particular kind of dignity that doesn't announce itself. And Ethan showed up. Not perfectly, sis. He was busy with the ranch, and there were weeks where she hardly saw him, and once he forgot, they'd agreed to have Sunday dinner at the hotel's public room, and she sat there for 30 minutes before he came through the door, looking genuinely flustered and apologetic in the way of a man who is not practiced at apologizing. "I lost track of time," he said. "One of the mares was having trouble, and then I had to—" He stopped. "I'm sorry. That's not an excuse." It's a reason, she said. There's a difference. He sat down across from her, still dusty from the stable. Are you angry? She considered it honestly. A little. Less now that you're here. I'll do better. I know you will. She looked at him across the table. I'm not asking you to be somebody else, Ethan. Just don't disappear. I won't, he said. He said it like a thing he was deciding, not just offering. She believed him. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. But because she knew how he made decisions, having watched him make them for 7 years, and he made them the way he did everything, slowly, carefully, and then completely. The Sunday dinners became regular. The Saturday visits at the bakery became expected. By December, when Ethan's father had a bad week and couldn't eat much, Clara started sending food out to the ranch on her delivery route without being asked. Not a grand gesture, just practical, just what you did for someone whose hands were full. Ethan came in on a Wednesday that week, not his usual day. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. But thank you. He looked at her in a way that she was still learning to hold without looking away. He asked who made the soup, I told him. He said, you're a good woman. Clara kept her hands busy with the counter she was wiping. How is he today? Better, a little better. He paused. He asked if I was courting you properly. She looked up. What did you say? I said I was trying to. The corner of his mouth moved. He said trying to isn't the same as doing it. Your father, Clara said, sounds like a sensible man. He has his moments. Ethan leaned against the counter. Clara. Ethan, I'm doing it, he said. Not trying to. Doing it. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a moment, this man who was not easy or smooth or perfect, who had been afraid for 5 years and was trying not to be afraid anymore, who showed up on Wednesdays when something mattered and still got the mayor situation wrong on Sundays, who had crouched down to eye level on his own floorboards and said, what I want is for you not to say yes to Julian Ashford. I know, she said. Outside, the December wind found the gap under the bakery door and pushed a thin curl of cold air across the floor. Inside it was warm, and the bread on the cooling rack smelled the way good things smell when they've been done right. Not perfect, because nothing ever was, but close enough that the difference barely mattered. The first letter arrived on a Monday in early January, which was how Clara knew it wasn't routine. Routine correspondence came on Wednesdays, when the mail rider made his pass through Blackstone Ridge from the county seat. A Monday delivery meant someone had paid extra to have it sent ahead, which meant someone wanted the recipient to have very little time to think before responding. She only knew about it because Ethan came in that afternoon with the envelope still in his hand, unopened, looking at it the way a man looks at something he already suspects is bad news but hasn't confirmed yet. From who? She asked. He turned it over. The return mark was a printed stamp, not handwritten. A company name, Crestfield Land and Property Holdings, with an address in Wichita. Don't know them, he said. Open it. He did, there at her counter, and read it standing up. She watched his face go through the same sequence she'd seen once before, when he'd told her about the foal and the mare on a Thursday morning, the controlled stillness of a man absorbing something painful by force of habit. He handed it to her without a word. The letter was written in the particular language of legal documents that was designed to sound formal while actually saying very little. What it said, stripped of its formality, was this. Crestfield Land and Property Holdings had filed a claim with the county land office asserting that a portion of the Mercer Ranch property, specifically the eastern parcel, 43 acres along the ridgeline, was subject to a prior deed that predated the Mercer family's title. The company was requesting that Ethan present his original land documentation to the county assessor's office within 30 days, pending which the claim would proceed to formal review. Clara read it twice. The second time she read it more slowly, paying attention to the specific words rather than the general shape of the thing. Have you had any contact with this company before? She asked. Never heard of them. And the eastern parcel, that's the ridgeland. The grazing land? Best grazing land on the property. That's where we run the mares in spring. His voice was even. She knew him well enough to understand that evenness was not the same as calm. My grandfather filed the original deed in 1847. My father renewed the title in 1869. I have both documents in the house. Then you should be fine, she said, and almost believed it. Ethan looked at her. Should be, he said. She handed the letter back. They were both quiet for a moment. I'll take the documents to the assessor Thursday, he said. Get it sorted. It didn't get sorted. What it got over the following 3 weeks was more complicated. The county assessor, a man named Briggs, whom Clara had dealt with twice over bakery licensing issues and had found both times to be professionally unhelpful, informed Ethan that the Mercer documents were in order, but that the Crestfield claim referenced a survey conducted in 1844 that appeared to predate them, and that the matter would require further review by the county land board. Further review, in Briggs's office, meant scheduling. Scheduling, in January, meant February at the earliest. And in February, Ethan was not the only one waiting. By the second week of January, 2 more letters had gone out from Crestfield Land and Property Holdings to 2 more ranchers in the Blackstone Ridge area. By the third week, there were 4. By the end of the month, 6 families were sitting on notices that put portions of their land under question, and the county assessor's office had become the most visited building in Blackstone Ridge outside of the saloon. Clara heard about each new notice through the bakery, which was where she heard most things. The ranchers came in, some angry, some frightened, some affecting a confidence she suspected they didn't fully feel, and they talked, the way people talk when they're worried and aren't sure what else to do. She listened. She kept the coffee hot and the rolls warm, and she listened to everything. She kept a mental ledger of what she heard. George Hadley, who ran cattle on the South Flats, had received a notice about his western boundary. The Connors family, with a sheep operation east of the ridge, had 2 parcels under question. Old Pete Sutherland, who was 73 and had worked his land for 40 years, had gotten a notice that cited a clerical error in his original filing and was now required to resubmit documentation he wasn't sure he still had. The notices were all worded differently. The specific parcels were different. The cited legal grounds were different. But the company name was the same on every one of them, and the return address in Wichita was the same, and the 30-day window was the same. Clara noticed. She started writing things down. Not dramatically. She didn't have a scheme, not yet. She was just doing what she always did when something needed figuring out, which was to put the pieces on paper where she could see them all at once. She used the back of the paper she kept for order records, the wide-ruled kind, and she wrote in her careful, slightly cramped hand that had never been taught properly and so had developed its own logic. She wrote down the names, the parcel descriptions, the dates the letters had arrived, the specific legal language each one used. She wrote down what she knew about the properties in question, which was more than people might have expected from a baker. She'd been in Blackstone Ridge for 7 years, and she'd extended credit to most of the ranching families at one point or another, which meant she had a working knowledge of who owned what and where. She looked at what she'd written for a long time one evening after closing, with the lamp turned up high and the wind working at the shutters. The parcels weren't random. That was the first thing. When she marked them in her mind against the geography of the area, they formed a rough corridor, starting at the eastern ridge and running southwest toward the valley floor, cutting through the middle of 6 different properties. Individually, each parcel was significant to its owner. Collectively, they were something else. She thought about what would occupy that corridor, if a single entity owned it. Water, mostly. The seasonal creek that came off the ridge ran directly through that stretch of land. And water, out here, was not incidental. She thought about cattle investment. She thought about Julian Ashford, who had come to look at land in the Eastern Valley and then departed. She didn't want to think about Julian Ashford, because what she was thinking was uncomfortable. She needed to know more about Crestfield land and property holdings. That was the problem with Blackstone Ridge. There was no easy way to know more about a company in Wichita from a town this size. She could write to the county seat and request records, but that took time and assumed the right records were accessible, which she was not prepared to assume. She could ask Briggs at the assessor's office, but Briggs was already demonstrating the particular uselessness of a man who has decided that something is not his problem. What she had was this: 6 ranchers, 1 company, a pattern that didn't make sense as coincidence, and the nagging conviction that 30 days was not an accident. She folded her paper and put it in her apron pocket and went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. On Saturday, she went to see Ethan. She found him in the stable, which was where he usually was on a cold Saturday morning, checking the mares that were due to foal in spring. He had a particular quietness in the stable that was different from his other quietnesses, more concentrated, less removed. She stood in the doorway while he ran a hand along the flank of a gray horse, checking something she couldn't name. "I need to show you something," she said. He looked up. "Come in out of the cold." She came in and spread her papers on the top rail of the empty stall, and he stood beside her and read, and she watched him read. He was a slow, careful reader. He read the whole thing before he said anything. "You mapped the parcels," he said. "In my head, yes. And you think they form a corridor along the creek drainage, yes." He was quiet for a moment. He pressed his thumb against the corner of one of the pages, thinking. Who would want a corridor of land running from the ridge down to the valley floor? Someone who wants control of the water access between the high grazing land and the valley, Clara said. Or someone who wants to run a single large operation across land that's currently divided between 6 families. Or both. A land corporation, Ethan said. Flat, not a question. With enough legal muscle to file 6 separate claims simultaneously and enough money to wait out the review process while people get scared enough to settle, she paused. Or to manufacture reasons why the existing titles are defective. Ethan looked at the pages again. The 1844 survey they cited in my notice. I've never seen it. I've read every land record associated with this property since my grandfather filed. Neither had any of the others, from what I can tell. George Hadley told me his notice cited a survey from 1841. Pete Sutherland cited 1843. They all predate the actual filed deeds, but nobody can find them to contest them, which means they might not exist, Ethan said. Or they exist in a form that was created recently, Clara said carefully. He looked at her. They both understood what she was saying. Manufacturing historical records was fraud. Fraud with the backing of a company large enough to file 6 simultaneous legal claims meant someone had calculated that the people they were targeting couldn't fight back effectively, which meant someone had looked at these ranchers, hardworking people, land-rich and cash-poor, with limited legal resources and an assessor's office that moved at the speed of cold molasses, and decided they were vulnerable. That made Clara angry in a very specific, very quiet way. "I want to talk to the others," she said, "all of them, together." Ethan looked uncertain. "George and Pete have already talked. It didn't go well. Because they were comparing problems, not looking for the pattern." She folded her papers. "If I can show them the map, show them what this looks like from above instead of from inside each individual situation, maybe they stop defending separately and start thinking about this as one problem. And if they won't, then I'll figure something else out." She met his eyes. "But I'd rather start with trying." Ethan nodded slowly. He knew what it would take to get 6 ranching families in the same room, the logistical difficulty of it, the egos involved, the fact that at least 2 of them had not been on speaking terms with each other for reasons Clara had never been able to fully clarify. He knew all of that. And he looked at her papers, and he said, "I'll talk to George first. He's the most reasonable. If I can get George, the others might follow." "Thank you," she said. He shook his head slightly. "Don't thank me. This is my land, too." "I know," she said, "but you didn't have to believe me." He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read. It had something of what she'd seen on his face that night in his front room, that unguarded quality, only quieter now. More settled, like something that had found where it belonged and stopped moving. "Yes, I did," he said simply, and went back to the mare. The meeting happened in the Hadley barn on the 2nd Thursday of February, which was the only day all 6 families could send someone. Clara was the only woman in the room, which she had expected, and which she addressed by starting to speak before anyone could decide whether her being there was a problem. She laid out what she had on an old crate and walked them through it. She didn't perform it. She just talked, the way she talked to customers who needed to understand why the price on something had changed, direct and factual with the reasoning visible. She showed them the parcel map, the dates, the pattern in the legal language. She told them what she thought was happening and why she thought it. The room was quiet through most of it. Afterward, it was Pete Sutherland who spoke first, which surprised her a little. Pete was old and generally cautious with his words. He sat on an overturned bucket with his hat on his knee and looked at her papers for a moment. "So they're not after any one of us," he said. "No," Clara said. "They're after the water rights. You each happen to own pieces of what they need." "And the 30-day window is to make us panic," said Mary Connors, who had come in place of her husband, who had a broken collarbone. She was a sharp-faced woman who Clara had always found more reliably intelligent than the way she was generally talked about. "Make us settle before we figure out it's coordinated." "That's what I think," Clara said. George Hadley, who was large and deliberate and not a man who spoke carelessly, had been looking at the map the whole time. "This survey they keep citing, the 1841, the 1843, the 44, all predating our titles." "Yes. I've pulled every county record I can get to. I can't find them." "I know. Nobody can." "Because they're not there," he said. "Probably not," Claire said, "but we need more than probable. We need to be able to show it to someone with legal standing to act on it." The room shifted a little at that. Legal standing meant attorneys, and attorneys meant money that most of them didn't have in ready supply in February, which was when winter had been eating at the feed stores for 3 months, and spring was still a promise. "I can't pay a lawyer right now," said Dan Foley, who ran a small horse operation north of town, and had come in smelling of the cold and looking like he hadn't slept well. "I can barely keep the hands-on through to March." "Nobody's paying a lawyer individually," Clara said. "If we're one problem, we hire one attorney together, divide the cost." "You got someone in mind?" Hadley asked. "Not yet," she admitted, "but I'm working on it." Ethan, who had been standing against the wall and saying nothing for the entirety of it, deliberately, she understood, because this was her case to make, said at that point, "I'll put in the first share, whatever it costs." Another silence, a different kind. Then Pete Sutherland said, "All right, me too." And Mary Connors said, "The Connors family's in." And Dan Foley looked at the floor, and then at Clara, and then said, "Fine, in." The other two were harder. The Brennan brothers, who owned the northernmost parcel, were resistant in the way of men who have learned that cooperating with neighbors eventually leads to obligations they don't want. It took 40 minutes of careful conversation, most of it between them and Hadley rather than Clara, before they agreed to participate with the caveat that they reserved the right to pursue their own legal course if the collective approach failed. Clara accepted that. Half-committed allies were better than none when the alternative was 6 separate families getting picked apart one at a time. She walked home from the Hadley barn in the dark. It was nearly 9 by the time everything wrapped up, with Ethan beside her on duster because he refused to let her walk back alone, and she was too tired to argue. "You convinced them," he said. "Most of them." "The Brennans will come around," he said. "They always do. They just need to be last." "I know." She pulled her coat tighter. Her feet hurt. She'd been on them since 4 in the morning. "Ethan, I need to find an attorney who isn't connected to anyone in this county." He thought about that. "Why?" "Because Briggs at the assessor's office has been worse than useless since these notices went out. And a company that files 6 simultaneous claims doesn't do that without some confidence that the local administration won't move against them quickly." She walked for a moment. "I don't know who's on what side, so I need someone from outside." He was quiet for a beat. "There's a man in Hayes City, Samuel Greer, did some work for a ranching association down in the valley 3 years ago, land title dispute. Won it." He looked at her. "Decent reputation. I don't know him personally. Can you find out more?" "I can ask around." "Carefully," she said. "Carefully," he agreed. They came to the edge of town and he stopped Duster. The bakery was 2 blocks up, its windows dark. "Clara." "What you did tonight, laying all of that out, making them see the whole picture instead of just their piece of it. Most people couldn't have done that." She looked up at him on the horse. He was not a man who said things like that freely, which meant when he said them, they landed differently. "They would have gotten there eventually," she said. "Maybe, but not before the 30 days were up." She said nothing. She was tired and her feet hurt, and she had a 4 o'clock morning ahead of her. "Get some sleep," Ethan said. "I'll find out about Greer." She went inside. What she had not told the group, and had not told Ethan either, not because she distrusted him, but because she wasn't ready to say it out loud until she was more certain, was what she had found in the bakery's records 3 days earlier. She kept meticulous accounts. She had since the first day she'd taken over the bakery, because the first day she'd taken over the bakery, she'd been 22 years old and terrified, and the only thing standing between her and disaster was knowing exactly where every penny was at all times. 7 years of that habit meant she had 7 years of records, and those records included the business accounts of customers she'd extended credit to, which was most of the ranching community at one point or another. She had been going through those records looking for anything that might help her understand the financial position of the affected families when she found something she had not been looking for. Julian Ashford had paid for his orders in cash, which was common enough, but on his third visit, he'd also left behind a folded piece of paper that she'd assumed was an unrelated personal document and had kept in the lost property box under the counter. She'd never opened it because it wasn't her business. She opened it now. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed to Julian from someone whose signature she couldn't fully read. The surname started with a V and ended in what might have been an N. The content was brief and written in the shorthand of two people who had discussed the matter at length before, which made it fragmentary and slightly difficult to parse. But several things were clear. 1. It referenced a land acquisition plan in the Blackstone Ridge area. 2. It mentioned a 30-day pressure window, specifically by name, as a strategy. 3. The letter predated Julian Ashford's arrival in Blackstone Ridge by approximately 2 weeks. Clara read it 3 times. She didn't know what Julian's involvement was, whether he'd been a willing participant, a recruited front, or someone who had been used without understanding the full scope of what he was walking into. She did not know if he was still in contact with whoever had sent the letter. She did not know if the signature with the V was connected to Crestfield land and property holdings, or was a separate element entirely. What she knew was that she had a document with a direct reference to the strategy being used against 6 ranching families, and that the document had come to her by accident and would not be known to whoever sent it. She put it in the same place she kept her most important bakery records, the locked tin box beneath the loose floorboard in the storeroom. She was the only person who knew it was there. She had one more thing to do before she could feel sure about any of this, and it was the thing she was least looking forward to. She needed to contact Julian Ashford, not because she was certain he could help, but because the letter had come from his pocket, and if there was any chance he had more information, or any chance that his conscience was sufficiently intact to make him willing to share it, then she needed to know before she brought Samuel Greer, if Greer was available, into a fight where incomplete information could get 6 families' land taken from them. She wrote the letter that night, after she'd set the morning bread to rise, sitting at her work table with the lamp close and the room cold because she'd let the fire go low. She wrote it carefully, saying only what needed to be said, asking only what needed to be asked. She sealed it. She addressed it to the last hotel Julian had mentioned intending to stop at, in the valley, on the chance he was still in the area. She set it by the door to mail in the morning and went to tend the fire that she'd let go low. And then she went over her papers one more time in the warmth of the rebuilt flame, because the situation was moving now. The pieces were moving, and she could feel the shape of something underneath all of it that she couldn't quite see yet. Something that went deeper than 6 land notices and a company in Wichita. She didn't know yet what it was, but she was going to find it. Julian Ashford's reply came 11 days after Clara sent her letter, which was faster than she'd expected and suggested he hadn't needed long to decide whether to respond. The envelope was heavier than a single-page letter would account for. She felt that weight before she opened it, standing at the back counter in the quiet hour before the first customers came, and she set it down and finished what she was doing. The morning rolls needed another 10 minutes, and she didn't burn things out of impatience, not anymore. And then she opened it with the bread knife because she'd misplaced the letter opener again. Julian had written 3 pages in a close, careful hand. He began without preamble, which she appreciated. He wrote that he had received her letter and that it had not surprised him as much as it perhaps should have. He wrote that he had come to Blackstone Ridge at the suggestion of a business associate named Harlan Voss, who had described the Eastern Valley land as an exceptional cattle investment opportunity and had offered to facilitate introductions and initial assessments. He wrote that he had understood this to be a straightforward business arrangement and that nothing in his early conversations with Voss had indicated anything beyond standard land acquisition practice. He wrote that he had begun to have doubts approximately a week into his stay, when certain details in the documents Voss had forwarded to him did not align with what he observed on the ground. He had not acted on those doubts. He wrote that plainly, without excuse. He had not acted on them. He had continued as instructed, and he understood that this was a failure he would have to sit with. He wrote that the letter she had found in his pocket had been from Voss, and that Harlan Voss was, to the best of his knowledge, a senior partner in Crestfield Land and Property Holdings, and the architect of whatever was being executed in Blackstone Ridge. He wrote that he had 3 additional letters from Voss in his possession, letters that referenced the fabricated survey documents by name, letters that discussed the 30-day window as a deliberate pressure mechanism, and 1 letter that mentioned, in passing, an arrangement with an unnamed county official that would ensure the review process moved in Crestfield's favor. That last sentence Clara read twice. He wrote that he was enclosing copies of 2 of the 3 letters, keeping 1 for his own protection. He wrote that he was doing this because he was not, on balance, a dishonest man, and that watching from a distance what appeared to be happening to people who had done nothing except own land that someone else wanted was something he found he could not continue to ignore. He wrote that he was aware this did not fully compensate for his earlier inaction and was not asking her to think well of him for it. He closed by saying that if she needed to reach him, he would be at the Carver Hotel in Salina for the next 3 weeks, and that she should use her own judgment about whether his name needed to appear in whatever she was building. Clara set the letter down on the counter. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and looked at nothing in particular. Then she took the bread out of the oven because it was done, and she set it on the cooling rack, and she sat down on the stool at the end of the counter, Ethan's stool, the one she thought of as his now without meaning to. And she read the letter again, this time including the 2 enclosed copies of Voss's correspondence. The first was operational. It discussed the survey documents, referred to them as the supplementary historical record, which was the kind of phrasing that meant the writer knew exactly what they were and had decided to call them something else. It named 3 specific parcels by their legal description and outlined the filing sequence. It was dated October, before the letters had gone out. The second was the one that mattered most. It was shorter than the first, written in a brisker tone that suggested Voss was comfortable enough with the recipient to drop formality. It referenced the county arrangement in 4 words, "Our friend at assessment." That was all. 4 words, no name, but enough. Clara thought about Briggs, about his professional unhelpfulness, his remarkable disinterest in the pattern of claims that had crossed his desk, his apparent inability to schedule a review hearing with any urgency whatsoever. Our friend at assessment. She put the letters in the tin box under the floorboard, alongside the original she'd found in Julian's pocket. Then she sat down and wrote 2 letters of her own. The first was to Samuel Greer in Hayes City, whom Ethan had quietly confirmed through 2 intermediaries was both honest and willing to take a case of this nature, pending a retainer the ranching group had agreed to split. The second was to the State Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, which was above the county level and therefore above Briggs, addressed to the commissioner directly and marked urgent. She did not write to Voss or to Crestfield. She did not tell anyone outside of Ethan what she had in the tin box. She understood by instinct and by the plain logic of the situation that the moment Crestfield knew someone was building a case against them was the moment they would start dismantling whatever they hadn't yet hidden. The letters from Voss were extraordinary luck, the kind that didn't repeat itself. The only advantage she had was that Crestfield didn't know she had them. She intended to keep that advantage until she no longer needed it. Ethan came in that Thursday looking like he'd been sleeping poorly, which she recognized because she'd been sleeping poorly too. He sat on his stool and she put coffee in front of him, and she told him about Julian's letter. She kept her voice low even though the bakery was empty, which was perhaps excessive, but felt right. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most about him. When she finished, he said, "Voss. Harlan Voss. Have you heard the name?" "No, but I can ask." "Carefully," she said, as she always said now. "I know." He turned the mug in his hands. "Clara, the letter that mentions the county arrangement, if Briggs is compromised, that means anything we file through his office goes to someone who's working against us." "I know." "So the Topeka letter goes around him entirely?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Greer needs to know about Briggs before he files anything locally. We can't let Crestfield get warning through the assessor's office." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "When does Greer come?" I asked him to come in 3 weeks, end of February. That's cutting close to some of the 30-day windows. I know, she said, but I needed the Topeka letter to go first. If the commissioner's office is looking at this before Greer files, we have a second front that Crestfield can't as easily contain. He looked at her in that way he had, the one that still occasionally caught her off guard, that particular quality of attention, like she was the most interesting thing in the room and he wasn't trying to hide it. You've been working on this for a while, he said, since the Hadley Barn meeting. Why didn't you tell me about the Voss letters sooner? The question was direct, without accusation, which was why she answered it honestly rather than deflecting. Because until Julian's letter came, I only had the one fragment from his pocket, and I wasn't certain enough to say out loud what I suspected. I didn't want to point you at something and be wrong. He nodded slowly. And now? Now I have enough. She met his eyes. I'm not wrong. He believed her. She could see that clearly, the way she could see most things clearly about him now that they'd stopped pretending in both directions. It was one of the unexpected gifts of this, not just the warmth of it, but the clarity. He trusted her judgment, not blindly, not without question, but genuinely in the way that mattered. All right, he said. What do you need from me? Talk to the others before Greer comes. Tell them to stop filing individually through Briggs's office. Anything they were planning to submit, hold it. They won't like that. No, but submitting through a compromised office is worse than waiting 3 weeks. The Brennans really won't like it. I know. She paused. You could frame it as a strategy rather than a delay. We're consolidating the approach. We're not backing down, we're regrouping. Which is true. Which is true, she agreed. He came back on Saturday with the news that he'd spoken to George Hadley and Pete Sutherland, and that both had agreed to hold. Mary Connors had agreed immediately. Dan Foley had taken 2 days to come around, but had gotten there. The Brennans had argued for an hour, and then agreed with conditions that Ethan summarized as roughly in line with what we need them to do, if not exactly what we asked. She accepted that. She was getting better at accepting partial victories on the way to something larger. Samuel Greer arrived in Blackstone Ridge on a gray Tuesday at the end of February, on the afternoon stage from Hayes City. Clara had expected, she wasn't sure why, someone older. Greer was somewhere in his mid-30s, lanky and dark-complexioned with reading glasses. He kept pushing up his nose and the slightly distracted air of a man whose mind was usually running 2 conversations ahead of the one he was in. He shook her hand when they met at the hotel, looked at her for a moment with sharp, assessing eyes, and said, "You're the one who put this together." "I'm the one who noticed the pattern," she said. "Same thing, in practice." He sat down. "Show me what you have." She showed him everything. The original letters, the Voss correspondence, her parcel map, her timeline of the notices, the discrepancy records she'd compiled from what the ranchers had shared about their original title documents. She laid it out in the same order she'd laid it out in the Hadley barn, but with more detail now. And Greer listened the way she imagined he listened to everything, completely, without performing comprehension, just taking it in. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the Voss letters. He picked up the one with the county arrangement reference and read it again. "Our friend at assessment," he said. "Briggs?" "Probably Briggs. You can't prove it from this alone." He set the letter down. "But you don't need to prove it to me. You need to prove it to someone with authority to act on it. And for that," he tapped the letter. "This is extraordinary, Miss Harlow. Do you understand how rare this is? Written correspondence from the principal party describing the mechanism of the fraud. This doesn't usually exist." "It came to me by accident," she said. "Most of the best evidence does." He straightened the papers. "Here's where we are. The Voss letters give us enough to support a fraud allegation. The fabricated surveys, we need to demonstrate they don't exist in the historical record, which means a filing with the State Archive Office requesting a comprehensive search, and we need that done before Crestfield can manufacture a paper trail to fill the gap. The county arrangement," he paused. "Has your letter to the Commissioner's office received any response?" "Not yet." "How long ago did you send it?" 3 weeks. Greer made a note. "I'll follow up directly. The Commissioner's office is slow but not incompetent. If they've been sitting on it, A letter from an attorney of record may move things. He looked at her. The ranchers have agreed to a unified approach? All 6 families. More or less. More or less, he repeated with a faint expression that might have been a smile. All right. I'll need to meet with each of them individually and get their title documentation centralized somewhere. I can review it. Can you arrange that? Yes. How soon? This week, if necessary. He looked at her again with that assessing quality. You're not a lawyer. No, I'm a baker. You understand you've done the bulk of the actual investigative work on this case. She understood that she had noticed things and written them down and followed them where they led, which was not something she thought of as exceptional. It was how she ran the bakery, how she managed the accounts, how she'd survived 7 years on her own in a town that had not always been generous toward her. It was just how she worked. I did what needed doing, she said. Greer nodded once, the way of a man filing something away. Then let's finish it. The next 2 weeks were the hardest, not because the work was uncertain, it wasn't, or not entirely. The work was grinding and tedious and required the kind of sustained focus that left her head aching by 9 at night, but the direction of it was clear. What made it hard was the waiting and the secrecy and the specific strain of holding a plan together while keeping its most critical elements invisible to the people who needed to not know about it. Greer filed the state archive request. He followed up with the commissioner's office and received, within 4 days, a response that indicated the commissioner had in fact been reviewing her letter and was prepared to open a preliminary inquiry into the Blackstone Ridge land claims, pending documentation from an attorney of record, which Greer now was. That was the first real victory, and Clara allowed herself to feel it for approximately 1 evening before moving on to the next problem. The next problem was Briggs. If Briggs was compromised, he would eventually notice that none of the targeted ranchers had submitted through his office in 3 weeks, and that an attorney had arrived in town, and that the state commissioner's office had made an inquiry. When he noticed, he would tell Voss. And when Voss knew, things would accelerate in ways that were harder to predict. Clara raised this with Greer on the Thursday of the 2nd week, while Ethan sat at the counter and listened and didn't pretend he wasn't listening. The timing problem, Greer said, nodding. He'd started coming to the bakery for these conversations because, as he'd put it, it was the only place in town where nobody found it unusual for him to be talking to her. If Briggs alerts Crestfield before we file in district court, they move their assets and pressure their contacts, and we get a much cleaner-looking operation to fight. So we need to file before he can warn them, Clara said. But to file, we need the archive search results, which take 3 to 4 weeks from submission. Yes. He picked up his coffee. Unless the archive search comes back early. Is there a way to accelerate it? If the commissioner's office makes a formal request alongside our attorney request, yes. It becomes a joint regulatory inquiry rather than a private legal matter, which moves it to a different processing track. He paused. I need to make that call to Topeka tomorrow. Make it tonight, Clara said. He looked at her. Tonight. If Briggs hasn't noticed yet, he will soon. Dan Foley went into the assessor's office 2 days ago to ask about a separate property matter. Unrelated, a fence line dispute with his neighbor. And Foley said Briggs asked him 3 times whether he'd retained counsel about the Crestfield notice. He didn't know why Briggs was asking. But we know. Ethan, at the counter, said, He's checking. He's checking, Clara confirmed. We have maybe a week before he puts the pieces together and sends something to Wichita. Greer pushed his glasses up. He was quiet for a moment, running the calculation. If I call Topeka tonight and the commissioner's office makes the formal request tomorrow morning, the archive search could come back in 10 to 12 days instead of 3 to 4 weeks. That's still tight, Ethan said. Tight, but workable. Greer looked at Clara. There's one more thing we need. She waited. The Voss letters are good. They're very good. But they're copies Julian made, not originals, which means Crestfield will argue chain of custody when we present them. We need either Julian himself to testify to their authenticity and origin, or we need something from Crestfield's own records that corroborates what the letters describe. The room was quiet. I'll contact Julian, Clara said. You think he'll testify? She thought about the letter he'd written, the 3 careful pages, the admission that he'd had doubts, and hadn't acted on them, the not asking her to think well of him for it. She thought about a man who had ridden 2 days to get a ring and had accepted her refusal with honesty and left a good tip and said he's a lucky man. I hope he knows that. I think he might, she said. She wrote to Julian that night, the second letter she'd sent him, shorter than the first and more direct. She told him what she needed and why, and she told him that his participation was voluntary and that she understood if he declined, and she told him that the testimony would require him to acknowledge publicly that he had been part of the initial approach, which she understood was not a comfortable thing to ask. His reply came in 6 days, which was faster than his first. He would come. He named a date, the following Thursday. He wrote that he had spent enough time in the company of his own discomfort about this matter and was ready to be useful. Greer received the archive results on the same day Julian's letter arrived, which Clara chose not to read as anything more than coincidence, but which did give the day a certain quality of momentum that she recognized as significant. The archive results were definitive. No survey existed in the state historical record for any of the dates cited in the Crestfield notices. Not 1841, not 1843, not 1844. The parcels referenced had no prior documentation in the archive. The state archivist had attached a formal certification to that effect, which Greer said was as good as they were going to get, and possibly better than he'd hoped. They had forged documents proven absent from the historical record. They had written correspondence from the fraud's architect describing the mechanism. They had a witness who had been recruited by that architect and was willing to testify. And they had the commissioner's office actively involved, which meant the filing would go to the district court in the county seat, above Briggs and his arrangements. Greer filed on Wednesday morning. He drove to the county seat himself rather than using the local office, which meant Briggs didn't see the papers until after they'd been docketed. By the time Briggs knew, it was too late to warn anyone usefully. Julian arrived on the Thursday stage, as he'd said he would. Clara met him at the hotel, and they sat in the public room, and she thanked him for coming, and he said it was the least he could do, which she thought was probably accurate and didn't say so. He was thinner than she remembered, or maybe just less carefully composed. He looked like a man who had been carrying something and was relieved to be setting it down. Voss told me it was a clean operation, he said. Land acquisition, willing sellers, straightforward dealings. I should have looked harder at the details before I came here. Why didn't you? He was quiet for a moment. Because the return was good and I was persuaded not to ask questions that might complicate it. He looked at the table. That's the honest answer. She accepted it as such. He testified 2 days later in a preliminary hearing before the district judge, a woman named Harriet Coombs, whom Clara had not encountered before, but who had the air of someone who did not waste time and did not appreciate having it wasted. Julian testified to the origin of the Voss letters, to the conversation in which Voss had described the survey strategy, to the explicit mention of the 30-day pressure window. He was calm and clear and did not try to minimize his own role. The Crestfield attorneys, there were 2 of them from the Wichita office, argued chain of custody on the letters and questioned Julian's credibility. Judge Coombs listened to both arguments with the same expression, which was not particularly encouraging to either side, and then suspended the Crestfield land claims pending a full fraud investigation. That was not the end. Clara had not expected it to be the end. The investigation would take months, and there would be more hearings, and Crestfield would not simply dissolve because a district judge had suspended their claims in one county. They had lawyers, and they had resources, and they had whatever other operations they were running in other places. But the claims were suspended. The rancher's land was not going anywhere. In the assessor's office, Briggs took a 2-week leave of absence at the suggestion of the commissioner's office that turned into a resignation the following month, though the precise nature of his arrangement with Crestfield was still under investigation. He did not speak publicly about it. Harlan Voss in Wichita issued a statement through his attorneys denying all allegations, which was what people did when they were very concerned about the allegations. Clara heard about most of this secondhand through the bakery, through Greer's occasional updates, and through Ethan, who was better than she expected at distilling a complicated situation into plain language. She kept making bread. She kept the accounts. She extended credit to the Foley operation for another 2 months while things settled, and she did not make a point of it. What she did make a point of was the morning 3 weeks after the hearing, when she came into the bakery at 4 and found a note had been slipped under the door. It was from Pete Sutherland in his old man's handwriting that pressed the letters too hard into the paper, and it said, "Miss Harlow, I have been in this valley 40 years, and I want you to know I understand what you did. Thank you. Pete." She set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she tied on her apron and started the bread, because it was 4 in the morning and there was a town to feed, and the work didn't pause because something good had happened. It just continued alongside the good thing, which was more or less how life went. At 7:30, when the first light was coming through the window, and the rolls were out, and the coffee was hot, and the street outside was beginning to move, Ethan came through the door on a Thursday. His Thursday, the same as it had always been, and ducked his head out of habit under the door frame that cleared him by 3 inches and sat on his stool and said, "Morning." "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She put the coffee in front of him. She did not ask why, because she knew why, just as she knew that he knew that she knew, and in the silence that followed, there was something that had not been there in the 7 years of previous Thursday mornings, something that had come through the other side of all of it. The fear and the waiting and the burning bread and the 4.5-mile walk in the dark and the Hadley barn and the tin box under the floorboard and the letters and the judge and all of the rest of it. It sat between them warm and solid and unremarkable as good bread. "Cinnamon loaf?" she asked. "Please," he said, and wrapped both hands around the mug. The investigation into Crestfield land and property holdings took 4 months and 11 days, which Clara knew because she counted them the way she counted everything. Not obsessively, just carefully, the way you track something that matters. The district court in the county seat issued its final ruling on a Thursday in late June, which she later thought was either perfect timing or the universe having a sense of humor about what Thursdays meant to her. Greer sent word ahead of the official notice, a brief telegram that arrived mid-morning while she was pulling the first bread of the day. Ruling complete. All 6 claims voided. 3 Crestfield principals indicted. Full letter follows. Greer. She read it twice, standing at the counter with flour on her hands, and then she set it down and went back to the bread, because the bread was not going to finish itself, and the town still needed feeding, regardless of whether justice had been served in the county seat. She told Ethan that afternoon when he stopped by, not on a Thursday, just because he did that now. Stopped by when something was happening, when something wasn't happening, when he was passing through town and the bakery light was on. He read the telegram and set it on the counter and looked at it for a moment. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He looked up at her. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do most things. She felt tired, which was the most accurate answer. She felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying a weight for long enough that they've forgotten the weight isn't permanent, and then had it removed, and discovered that the absence of a thing can be as disorienting as the thing itself. She felt relieved, and underneath the relief something quieter that she recognized after a moment as grief. Not for anything she'd lost, but for what those 6 families had been put through, for Pete Sutherland's 40 years, for the way fear had moved through Blackstone Ridge like a cold draft under a door for the past 5 months. "Like it should have been prevented," she said. Ethan nodded. He understood what she meant, that the wind didn't undo the months of it, that 6 families would still remember what it felt like to have their land threatened by people who counted on them being too isolated and too poor and too divided to fight back effectively. That was a thing that left a mark regardless of how it ended. But it wasn't, she added. So, he said. The full details arrived in Greer's letter 2 days later. Harlan Voss and 2 other Crestfield principals, a man named Edwin Cross, who had overseen the surveying fraud, and a woman named Dale Marsh, who had managed the financial structure of the operation, had been indicted on charges of land fraud, falsification of historical documents, and conspiracy. The fabricated surveys had been traced to a cartographer in Wichita who had produced them on commission and had, once he understood the legal situation, cooperated extensively with investigators. Briggs, the assessor, had accepted a reduced charge in exchange for testimony about the nature of his arrangement with Crestfield, which had been, in summary, a series of cash payments in exchange for ensuring the review process moved in a direction favorable to the company's claims. He was stripped of his position and prohibited from holding any county office. He did not contest either condition. Julian Ashford was not charged. The investigators had found his cooperation credible, and his financial involvement at the level of a deceived participant rather than a knowing conspirator. Greer's letter included a brief note on this point, neutral and factual, leaving Clara to form her own opinion about it. She formed one that was complicated and did not reduce to simple judgment, which was more or less where she'd been on Julian Ashford from the beginning. What she hadn't anticipated, and this, in retrospect, she probably should have, was what the ruling did to Blackstone Ridge's understanding of itself. Towns have a way of absorbing things and then deciding what to make of them, and what Blackstone Ridge decided to make of the Crestfield investigation, once it was over and safe to discuss openly, was that it had been a very close call that had been averted by one person's particular combination of stubbornness and attention. That person was Clara Harlow, and the town was not uniformly comfortable with this, which was perhaps the most honest thing about Blackstone Ridge's response. Some people came into the bakery and said thank you directly, with the specific awkwardness of people who are doing something they know they should have done earlier. George Hadley brought her a bottle of good whiskey that she didn't drink but kept on the shelf because it meant something. Pete Sutherland, who had already sent the note, came in person and held her hand with both of his, and didn't say much because he was old enough to know when words didn't add up to the occasion. Mary Connors brought her sister, who was 18 and newly arrived in town and looking for work, and asked if Clara had any use for an extra pair of hands. Clara said she'd think about it, which was how she said yes when she needed a day to work out the practical details. The harder responses were the ones from people who had things to revise about how they'd thought of her. Tom Bassett came in on a Friday, which he didn't usually do, and bought a loaf he didn't need and lingered at the counter in the way of a man who has something on his mind. She waited. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Some things I've said over the years about you and what you were good for and what kind of life you'd end up with." He looked at the counter. "I was unkind, and I was wrong, and those two things probably go together." Clara looked at him for a moment. Tom Bassett was not a bad man. He was an ordinary man who had absorbed his town's ordinary opinions and applied them without much examination, which described most people at some point in their lives, and described her too, probably in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. "Apology accepted," she said. He looked up, slightly surprised, as if he'd expected more from her, more difficulty, or more occasion. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. "You came in and said it plainly. That's not nothing." She went back to what she was doing. "Take care of yourself, Tom." He left with his unnecessary loaf, and she didn't watch him go. Mrs. Calloway never came in and apologized, which Clara had not expected her to and had not needed. There were people who revised and people who didn't, and the ones who didn't were not her project to fix. She had enough projects. The sister Mary Connors had brought, her name was Nell. She was thin and quick-moving with nervous hands and a tendency to look at the floor when she wasn't sure of herself. Started at the bakery in July, 3 mornings a week, learning the basic production work. She made mistakes at first, the predictable ones, and Clara corrected them the way she'd been corrected by Martin Crew all those years ago. Once, clearly, without theater. Nell was a fast learner. More importantly, she was someone who had been told for most of her young life that she wasn't particularly useful, which Clara could identify from a distance without being told. She saw it in the way Nell braced herself for criticism even when none was coming, the way she looked genuinely startled the first time Clara said, "That's well done. The crust on this is exactly right." "Is it really?" Nell said. "Would I say it if it wasn't?" Clara said. Nell thought about that for a moment, and then she went back to work with something slightly different in her posture. Clara noticed that too. She noticed most things. It was Ethan who brought up the question she'd been circling for several weeks, on a Saturday afternoon in August when the heat had settled over everything and the bakery was quiet because nobody wanted to be near an oven in August. He came in and sat on his stool and drank the cold coffee she kept in the summer months and said, not dramatically, not with ceremony, "Clara, will you marry me?" It was not quite a question, which was how she knew it wasn't impulsive. He'd been working toward this the way he worked toward everything, slowly, then all at once. She looked at him across the counter. She thought about the first time she'd noticed him, which she genuinely couldn't pinpoint anymore because it had been gradual, the way she'd told him, water into stone, the crack appearing without a clear moment of cause. She thought about the loaf she'd burned the morning she'd let her mind go too far. She thought about the gate she'd stood at in the dark for 30 seconds before she opened it. "Not because of the land business," he said. "I want to say that clearly. If you'd never noticed the pattern, if none of that had happened, I would still be asking you this question. The timing is bad, I know. You could think I'm asking because of everything that happened, and I'm not. I know, she said. I just didn't want there to be any. I wanted to be clear about the reason. Ethan. She said his name the way she said most things. Plain, direct, without decoration. You came in here every Thursday for 7 years before any of that happened. You patched my roof on a Friday for no reason. She paused. I know the reason. He held her gaze. Is that a yes? She had thought about it for a second longer than was probably necessary, not because she was uncertain, but because she was 30 years old and had spent a significant portion of her adult life building things on her own. And the act of saying yes to something this large felt like it deserved a moment of full attention rather than a reflex. Yes, she said. He exhaled. She had not realized until she saw his shoulders come down how tensely he'd been waiting. All right, he said. All right, she said. It was not the most romantic exchange in the history of Blackstone Ridge. There were no flowers on the counter, and she had flour on her apron, and he had spent the morning in the stable and smelled accordingly. This did not strike either of them as a problem. They were married in October, which was how it came back around to where it had started. October, 1 year after Julian Ashford's letter on the bakery counter, 1 year after the walk in the dark, and the gate and the almanac on the floor. The ceremony was at the town hall because it was the largest indoor space that didn't belong to anyone with an opinion about the occasion, and it was performed by the justice of the peace, a man named Roy Adler, whom Clara had known for years, and who did the thing without embellishment. Most of Blackstone Ridge came. Not all of it. Some people had opinions they decided were more important than attendance, but most of it. George Hadley and his wife. The Connors family, including Mary, who cried in the way of a person who cries at occasions and is comfortable with it. Pete Sutherland, who sat in the front row in his good jacket. Nell, who stood in the back and wore the expression of someone watching something she was filing away for future reference. Ethan's father was there, in a chair brought especially for him on one of his better days. He had declined considerably over the winter and spring, and Clara had made a point of visiting the ranch twice a week through the worst of it. Not to nurse him, she wasn't a nurse, but to bring food and to sit with him when Ethan needed to work and the old man needed company. He knew her clearly on his good days. On his less good days, he knew she belonged, even if he couldn't always say exactly how. He watched the ceremony with the particular attention of a man who understands he is watching something worth watching. When it was over and she bent to say something to him, she couldn't remember afterward exactly what. He took her hand and held it for a moment and said, "Good woman," I told him. "You did," she said. He listened. The old man smiled at that, the particular smile of a father who knows he raised someone right after all. Samuel Greer came, which surprised her. He'd been back through Blackstone Ridge twice since the ruling on other business and had gotten into the habit of stopping at the bakery, and she'd developed for him the specific fondness she had for people who were exceptionally good at what they did and didn't make a production of it. He shook Ethan's hand and told Clara she'd done the most organized case preparation he'd seen from a non-attorney in his career, and she thanked him and told him he could have the credit publicly, and he said he'd rather have the almond rolls, which was the right answer. The reception was at the bakery, which was the only place that made sense to her. She'd baked for 3 days prior. Not because she couldn't have asked people to bring things, she could have, but because this was what she did. This was the specific way she expressed the things she couldn't always say in words, and she wanted to feed these people with her own hands on this particular day. Ethan had helped the last morning without being asked, standing at the counter in the way of a man who had spent enough time in a place to understand its rhythms, and they'd worked side by side for 4 hours and talked very little, and it had felt like the most ordinary possible thing, which was exactly how she'd wanted it to feel. The months that followed were not without difficulty. She wanted to be honest about that, because the story of Clara Harlow and Ethan Mercer was not the story of two people who found each other and thereafter had an easy time of it. Marriage is not a solution to things so much as a context in which things continue to happen. The old man died in November, quietly, in his sleep, which was a mercy and also a loss that moved through the Mercer household differently than Clara had anticipated. Not as a single event, but as a series of small absences. A chair that didn't need moving, a preference for coffee that nobody held anymore. Ethan grieved in the way he did most things, quietly, over a long time, without making a show of the architecture of it. She let him grieve, and she didn't fill the space with noise, and on the hard nights she stayed close and said little and was there. He did the same for her the following spring, when the bakery had a difficult quarter, a stretch of weeks where the weather kept people inside and orders fell off, and she made some calculations that made her lie awake revising them. He didn't fix it. He couldn't fix it. He sat at the counter on Saturday afternoons while she worked and kept her company, and occasionally pointed out when she was catastrophizing, which she appreciated even when she didn't say so. What changed the year after the wedding was the bakery itself. Nell had continued, 3 mornings expanding to 4, and then to full weeks, and she had turned out to have an instinct for the production side of things that Clara had not invented and had not taught. It was simply there, the same way Clara's own instinct had been there at 22, waiting for someone to take it seriously. By the following spring, Clara had taken on a second helper, a young widow named Ruth, who'd come to Blackstone Ridge from the east with a child and limited prospects and considerable practical competence. By summer, the bakery was producing twice its original output, and Clara had started supplying wholesale to the hotel's kitchen and the general store, and on a trial basis to a new settlement 20 miles east that had no baker of its own. She had also, without particularly intending to, started something she didn't have a name for at first. It began with Nell. When Nell had been working with her for 6 months, she'd started making the same kind of comments that Clara had heard all her life. Comments from town about whether a young woman on her own could really manage, whether Nell had thought through what she was trying to build, whether there was a steadier option. Nell didn't report these comments in a spirit of distress exactly, more in the spirit of someone collecting data on a phenomenon they'd encountered before. Clara had said, "What do you want to do?" Nell had said, "I want to be able to run this kind of operation, on my own, eventually." Clara had said, "Then that's what we're working toward." That had been the beginning of it. Not a grand program, not a declared mission, just a habit she began to develop of talking plainly to the young women who came through the bakery, about money, about accounts, about how to extend credit sensibly, and how to identify when someone was asking for your effort in exchange for their approval rather than anything useful. About what it actually looked like to build something with your own hands, which was that it was slow and unglamorous, and you burned things sometimes, and you second-guessed yourself, and you sat at your work table at midnight trying to make the numbers add up, and it didn't stop being all of those things just because you got good at it. She talked to Ruth about it. She talked to Nell. She talked to 2 other young women in Blackstone Ridge who came to her in the way that people come to someone who has done a thing they want to do, tentatively, as if asking might jinx it. She talked to Mary Connors' youngest, who was 15 and had started coming in on Saturday mornings under the pretext of buying bread and actually wanting to watch how the accounting was done. She didn't talk to them about what they deserved or what they were worth. She'd always found that kind of talk slightly hollow. Not because it was wrong, but because worth was not a fixed thing that someone could simply declare and have it be so. What she told them was simpler than that. You build the thing, and the thing becomes evidence, and evidence is more durable than anyone's opinion. She had found this to be true in her own life, and she offered it without insisting they had to find it true in theirs. Ethan watched this develop over the course of a year with the particular attention he gave things he found genuinely interesting. He mentioned it on a Saturday evening in the spring, 2 years after the wedding, when they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house. She spent some nights there now, not all of them. They had worked out an arrangement that suited the reality of 2 people each with an operation to run. And the air had that quality it got in spring on the ridge, warm but with a thread of cold still in it, the season not quite decided. "You know what you're doing at the bakery is more than running a bakery," he said. "I'm running a bakery," she said. "You're also doing the other thing." "What other thing?" He looked at her. "The thing where you tell women the truth about what it takes and then actually show them." She thought about that. "Martin Crew did something similar for me. He let me work in his kitchen when I was 17 and he paid me a real wage, and he said, 'This is how you do this thing,' which nobody had said to me before in that practical a way." She paused. "I don't think I'm doing anything remarkable." "The fact that you don't think it's remarkable," Ethan said, "might be exactly what makes it work." She considered that for a moment. Outside, Duster moved in the paddock, a dark shape against the last of the evening light. "How's the east parcel?" she asked. "Good. Spring grass came in better than last year." He stretched his legs out. The foals are strong, 3 of them with real potential. You sound surprised. I'm always surprised when things go right. He said it with a slight wryness that she recognized. It was the honesty of a man who had had enough hard years to know not to count on the easy ones. Less surprised than I used to be. She understood that. She felt it too. Not a sense that things were guaranteed to stay good, but a different relationship with difficulty. Something that had come from having been through actual difficulty and knowing she had the capacity for it. The burning bread and the 4.5-mile walk and the tin box under the floorboard and all of it. She had not become fearless, exactly. She had become less afraid of the things she knew she could handle and better at identifying which things those were. The investigation was fully concluded in the late summer of the second year. Harlan Voss was convicted on the primary charges and received a sentence that would occupy him for several years. Edwin Cross and Dale Marsh received shorter sentences commensurate with their levels of involvement. The cartographer who had produced the fraudulent surveys cooperated to the end and received probation, which Greer noted in a letter was probably appropriate given that he'd been hired under false pretenses and had eventually done the right thing. Greer's final letter on the matter also included a line that Clara read twice. I want to say directly that the outcome of this case rested substantially on the investigative groundwork completed before I was retained. Any attorney could have filed those papers. Not everyone would have assembled the evidence that made filing possible. You should know that. She put the letter in the tin box with the others. She thought about whether it was strange to keep them in the same place, the Voss correspondence and Pete Sutherland's note and Greer's letters, and decided it wasn't. They were the same story, different pieces of it. Blackstone Ridge was not transformed by any of it. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own accounting, because the kind of story where a community undergoes a complete moral renovation after a single event was not the kind of story that happened. People were people. Mrs. Calloway remained the person she'd always been. There were still men who looked through Clara rather than at her, and still occasions when her presence in a conversation was treated as coincidental rather than substantive. But things had shifted. Quietly, incrementally, in the way of things that shift without announcement, and then suddenly seem like they've always been that way. The young women came to the bakery. The ranchers brought their business concerns to Clara because she had established beyond argument that she understood the landscape, and understanding the landscape mattered out here more than credentials or connections. The town council, which had not historically paid much attention to her opinions on matters outside bread and occasional credit, began to find that her opinions on other matters had a way of being relevant, and that ignoring relevant opinions was expensive. She was not beloved by everyone. She had not set out to be. She had set out to run her bakery and tell the truth and notice things that mattered and not let fear make decisions for her that she was capable of making herself. Those things remained true even now, even on the good days, especially on the good days, because the good days were when it was easiest to assume the work was done. The work was never done. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd year of their marriage, Ethan came in early, before the first customers, and sat on his stool and watched her work. She was in the middle of the morning production, hands in the dough, and she didn't stop because the bread didn't care what the occasion was. You know what I've been thinking about? He said. Probably the north fence. You've had that look. The north fence is a separate issue. He wrapped both hands around the coffee she'd put in front of him without asking. I've been thinking about that night you showed up at my door. She kept working the dough. And? I almost didn't answer. I heard the knock and I thought, whoever it is, whatever it is, it can wait until morning. I was tired. She looked up at him. You almost didn't answer the door. I almost didn't answer the door, he confirmed. She let that sit for a moment. The absurdity of it, the fragility of the whole thing. 7 years, and then one night, and then almost a closed door. But you did, she said. I did. Why? He thought about it with the seriousness she'd always valued in him. Because I heard the knock and I thought, it's late, it's cold. Somebody's standing out there and knocked. That means something. He paused. I was right about that part. Clara pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. You were right about that part, she agreed. The morning light was coming through the window the way it came in October, low and long, laying itself flat across the counter, and the flour and the cooling rack and the 2 mugs and the stool and the man sitting on it. The street outside was quiet in the way of a town that was about to wake up. That particular held-breath moment before the day started being the day. She had built this. She had kept building it. It was not perfect, was not smooth, would not be. The accounts would have bad months, and the north fence needed attention, and grief came back around the anniversary of the old man's death. And there were days when Ethan was distant in the way of a man who had carried a lot of things alone for a long time and still forgot sometimes that he didn't have to. There were days when she was impatient, and days when she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, and days when the town reminded her in small, sharp ways that it had not entirely revised its opinions. But she was here. She had built something worth being here in. She had done it with her hands and her attention and her particular stubbornness that the town had once called a flaw, and that she had long since decided to call an asset. She thought about Nell, who had opened a small confectionery operation in the next town, with a loan Clara had structured personally. She thought about Ruth, whose child was 4 now, and who had taken over the Thursday morning production entirely. She thought about Mary Connors' youngest, who was 17 and already keeping books with a precision that made Clara quietly proud in the way she was proud of things that she'd had some part in but were not really hers. She thought about what it meant to change a place, not in the way of speeches or grand gestures, but in the way of water finding cracks. The slow, persistent, completely unremarkable way of showing up every day and doing the thing and telling the truth and not requiring anyone's permission to be capable. She thought about the gate at the Mercer Ranch, how she'd stood there with her hand on the post in the October dark, counting to 30. She was glad she'd opened it. "More coffee?" she asked. Ethan held out his mug. "Please." She filled it. She went back to the bread. The morning came in through the window and settled on everything, and outside Blackstone Ridge was waking up, and the day was beginning the way days began, imperfectly, ordinarily, with all of its difficulties still ahead and all of its possibility still intact. Clara Harlow, who was now Clara Mercer, who had walked 4.5 miles in the dark for a chance at something true, pressed her hands into the dough and kept working. That was the whole of it. That was enough.